Frank Dempsey, a humble 79-year-old veteran, arrives early at the Austin Military Museum for a Veterans Memorial service, clutching a worn photo album. Mistaken for an outsider due to his simple attire, he's nearly ejected from the VIP section by a security guard. Whispers and judgment fill the air until General Charles Landon, a four-star general, strides in and salutes Frank, stunning the crowd. Why does a high-ranking officer honor this unassuming man? What secrets lie in Frank's past, tied to a jungle battlefield decades ago? Uncover the truth behind this viral moment of respect and redemption. Discover more inspiring stories like Frank's. Subscribe to our channel for tales of unsung heroes and moments that redefine honor. Your support keeps these stories alive. Join our community, hit that subscribe button, and never miss a story that deserves to be remembered. The polished auditorium of the Austin Military Museum buzzed with anticipation, its gleaming wooden floors and brass fixtures reflecting the weight of history. Military flags, their vibrant colors standing proud against the walls, framed a room filled with sharply dressed officers, politicians in tailored suits, and donors exuding wealth and influence. The air carried the faint hum of murmured conversations, the clink of glasses, and the rustle of formal attire. Amid this sea of prestige, Frank M. Dempsey shuffled quietly through the crowd, his steps deliberate and slow. At 79, his body no longer moved with the vigor of youth, each motion a negotiation with aching joints and old wounds. He had arrived 30 minutes early for the Veterans Memorial service, not out of eagerness but necessity, hoping to secure a seat before the room filled. His weathered civilian coat, adorned with a few tarnished medals pinned carefully to the breast pocket, hung loosely on his frame. Under his arm, he clutched a canvas-wrapped photo album, its edges frayed and singed, a relic of decades past that he held with the tenderness of a sacred artifact. Frank's eyes, still sharp despite the years, scanned the room, searching for a quiet corner where he could sit unnoticed. He hadn't seen the sign at the entrance proclaiming the honor reception area reserved for distinguished military guests. To him, it was just another doorway in a building meant to honor the sacrifices of those like him. He wove through the crowd, his gaze lowered, avoiding the curious glances of those who noticed his unpolished appearance. The weight of their stares pressed against him, a silent judgment of his simple clothes and stooped posture. He felt the familiar pang of being out of place, a sensation that had haunted him in moments like this since the war ended. Yet he pressed forward, driven by a quiet resolve to pay his respects to the friends who never made it home, their faces preserved in the worn pages of the album he carried. Finding an empty chair in the third-to-last row, Frank paused, his knees creaking in protest as he bent to set his photo album on the seat. A sharp twinge shot through his leg, a reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through his body decades ago in a war most in this room were too young to comprehend. The pain was more than physical. It stirred memories of muddy trenches, the deafening roar of artillery, and the faces of men who had become brothers, only to be lost in the chaos. He steadied himself, gripping the chair for support, his heart heavy with the weight of those memories. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to hope he could sit here, unnoticed, and simply honor the past in peace. But peace was not to be. A young security officer, his black uniform crisp and his earpiece glinting with authority, approached swiftly. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice sharp and carrying across the hall. "This section is not open to the general public. You'll need to move to the designated public seating area." Frank looked up, his weathered face creasing with confusion. The officer's tone was firm, unyielding, and it drew the attention of those nearby. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and eyes raked over Frank's worn jacket and trembling hands. "I'm sorry," the officer continued, louder now, as if to ensure everyone heard. "This section is reserved for official guests only. You'll need to relocate to the public gallery." The words stung, each one a small cut to Frank's pride. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the silent assessments of his appearance, his age, his apparent lack of status. A woman in a sleek dress leaned toward her companion, her whisper cutting through the air. "How did he even get in here?" Her companion, a man in a tailored suit, smirked. "Probably confused, wandered in from the street." Their words were soft but deliberate, meant to be overheard, and they landed like blows. Frank's chest tightened, not with any serious anger, but with a deep, familiar ache, the kind that came from being dismissed, from being invisible in a world that had moved on without him. He straightened as much as his old injuries allowed, his spine protesting, but his dignity refusing to bend. "I didn't realize," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I only came to remember my friends." The security officer's hand moved to his radio, his expression hardening. "Sir, if you don't move voluntarily, I'll need to—" His words were cut short by a voice that sliced through the murmurs like a bayonet. "Stand down, officer. That man is not leaving." The command was deep, authoritative, and carried the weight of someone who expected immediate obedience. The guard froze, his hand hovering over the radio, his face paling as the room fell into a stunned silence. Frank turned slowly, his heart pounding, unsure of what was happening, but feeling the shift in the air. And all eyes followed the source of the voice, a tall figure in a pristine dress uniform, striding purposefully across the polished marble floor. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder, catching the light like beacons. The crowd parted instinctively as General Charles Landon, a current member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, approached with measured, deliberate steps that echoed in the stillness. Frank stood motionless, his hand still clutching the photo album, its worn canvas grounding him as the general closed the distance. 3 feet away, General Landon stopped, his posture snapping to perfect attention. The room held its breath. With the precision of a lifetime in the military, Landon raised his right hand in a formal salute. "Sir, it's an honor," he said, his voice steady but laced with reverence. The security officer's radio slipped from his grasp, forgotten, as his face drained of color. Whispers erupted like wildfire, phones emerging from pockets to capture the scene. "Who is that old man?" someone murmured. "Why is General Landon saluting him?" another voice hissed. Frank, his heart thudding in his chest, returned the salute with a practiced motion, though it had been years since he'd last done so. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from a lifelong past, but it carried the weight of decades of service, sacrifice, and unspoken loss. In that moment, Frank felt a rush of emotions he couldn't name: pride, vindication, but also a deep sorrow. He hadn't come here for recognition, only to honor the men in his album, the ones who never got to grow old. Yet, as General Landon's salute held, Frank felt the eyes of the room shift from judgment to curiosity, perhaps even respect. He stood a little taller, the pain in his knees fading for a moment, replaced by the quiet strength that had carried him through battles and years of solitude. The general's gesture was more than a salute. It was a bridge across time, connecting the forgotten sacrifices of men like Frank to the present, where they were too often overlooked. The room, once dismissive, now buzzed with questions, and Frank, still clutching his album, felt the weight of his past settle into something new, a recognition that, for one fleeting moment, he was seen. The officer's face had gone ghostly pale, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and embarrassment as he fumbled for words. "This gentleman," he said, voice cracking under the weight of the moment, "will be seated at the front with a distinguished guest. Please, escort him to the first row." His stammering response, "Yes, sir, right away, sir," betrayed his sudden awareness of the gravity of his mistake. The air in the hall buzzed with murmurs as camera flashes erupted like tiny stars, capturing the scene. General Charles Landon, his posture rigid yet softened by reverence, gently took the worn photo album from Frank Dempsey's trembling hands. "Allow me to carry this for you, sir," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Together they moved toward the front of the crowded room, the sea of onlookers parting instinctively, their whispers trailing behind. No one caught the general's hushed words to Frank, spoken so softly they seemed to belong to another time. "I've been searching for you for 53 years. Vietnam, 1969. Back then, the jungle was a relentless beast, its air heavy with monsoon rain that turned the earth into a treacherous mire. Private Charles Landon, barely 19, lay sprawled in the mud, his thigh torn open by a sniper's bullet. Pain seared through him, each pulse of blood a reminder of how close he was to slipping away. The extraction point was 2 kilometers off, an impossible distance as enemy fire rained down. His unit had been ordered to retreat, their boots pounding a desperate rhythm through the undergrowth. Charles's vision blurred, his strength ebbing, as the sounds of gunfire and shouted commands grew distant. He was alone, exposed, the jungle closing in like a predator. Death felt inevitable, and in his heart he surrendered to it, whispering to himself, "This is it." But Specialist Frank Dempsey, already bloodied from shrapnel embedded in his back, refused to let fate have its way. Ignoring the orders to evacuate, he turned back, his face set with a stubborn resolve that drowned out the pain screaming through his body. The retreating soldiers blurred past him, their faces a mix of fear and exhaustion, but Frank's eyes were fixed on the spot where Charles lay. When he reached the younger man, Charles gasped, "Leave me. It's too late." His voice was weak, pleading, but Frank only grinned through gritted teeth, his eyes fierce with defiance. "Not today, kid," he said, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. With a strength born of sheer will, Frank hoisted Charles onto his shoulders, the weight of the younger man pressing against his own wounds. For 7 grueling hours, he carried Charles through swollen streams and tangled underbrush, dodging enemy patrols, his every step a battle against collapse. By the time they stumbled into the American lines, Frank's blood mingled with Charles's, their shared sacrifice staining the earth. They collapsed at the medical tent, and as Charles slipped into unconsciousness, the last thing he saw was Frank's face, pale but unyielding. 3 days later, Charles woke in a field hospital, his leg bandaged, his life miraculously intact. But Frank was gone, transferred to another base, their paths severed by the chaos of war. For 53 years, Charles carried the weight of that debt, the memory of a man who risked everything for him etched into his soul. Frank, meanwhile, had buried the war deep within himself, returning to a quiet life in East Austin, where he lived modestly, his heroism known only to the ghosts of his past. Now, at the memorial service, the past collided with the present. As the ceremony unfolded, social media ignited with the story. A sharp-eyed attendee recognized Frank from grainy Vietnam-era photographs and posted a side-by-side comparison. A young Frank, grim-faced in combat gear, cradling a wounded soldier, and an elderly Frank, stooped but proud, receiving a general's salute. The post spread like wildfire, racking up thousands of shares within hours. Captions screamed, "Man nearly thrown out of veterans event saved general's life 50 years ago." The comments were a torrent of outrage and admiration. "Who was the guard who tried to kick him out? Fire him," one user demanded. "This is how we treat our heroes? Shameful," another wrote. Some attendees, haunted by their silence during Frank's near humiliation, posted apologies. "I was there and said nothing," one confessed. "I'm ashamed of myself. I watched an old man being disrespected and stayed quiet. Never again." The collective guilt and awe rippled through the crowd, amplifying Frank's story into a symbol of overlooked valor. By evening, news vans clogged the street outside Frank's small home. Reporters knocked relentlessly, their cameras trained on his modest bungalow. Frank, overwhelmed, drew his curtains and unplugged his ancient phone, its rare rings now incessant. Alone in his living room, he sat with the photo album he'd brought to the ceremony, not for recognition, not to find Charles, but to honor the friends who never made it home. The faded images stared back at him, young men in uniforms, their smiles frozen in time, many lost to that brutal day in 1969. Frank's heart ached with the weight of their absence. He hadn't sought the spotlight. Fame felt like a betrayal of the quiet duty that had defined him. The irony gnawed at him. After decades of anonymity, he was now a reluctant hero, celebrated for an act he saw as nothing more than what any soldier would do. In his mind, he heard their voices, the ones who didn't return, whispering, "Worthy." True value, he knew, lay not in accolades but in the silent sacrifices no one saw. A week later, a sleek black car with military plates rolled to a stop outside Frank's home. A uniformed aide stepped out, delivering a sealed envelope bearing the Pentagon's crest. Inside was a formal invitation. "The Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff request the honor of your presence at a special recognition ceremony in Washington, D.C., 3 days hence." Frank's first instinct was to decline. Attention had always felt like a spotlight he didn't deserve. But tucked alongside the invitation was a handwritten note, its words piercing his resolve. "Some debts can never be repaid, but they should at least be acknowledged. Please come, Frank. Not for me, but for the others who never received their due. Charles. The ceremony took place in the Pentagon's inner courtyard, a quiet gathering far from the glare of public spectacle. Men and women in their 70s and 80s, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall despite the years, greeted Frank with nods of understanding and firm, respectful handshakes. Their eyes held the same unspoken bond, a recognition of battles fought and debts owed. In the courtyard, history hummed with shared glances and unspoken bonds. Frank Dempsey stood among faces from another life. Soldiers, medics, pilots, each stirring memories too heavy for daily wear. His hands, weathered by time, anchored him against the swell of emotion. He was here for Charles, not glory. General Landon took the podium, his uniform a tapestry of service, eyes seeking Frank's. Frank Dempsey is why I'm here, he said, voice thick. He's why I served 47 years, met my wife, had children, grandchildren. His voice broke briefly. At 19, bleeding out in hostile land, I was saved by Frank's impossible choice, defying orders, reason, survival. Frank stared at his hands, memories of gunfire and smoke vivid. He'd acted not for praise but necessity. Charles's words felt distant, unneeded. Frank's heroism was buried in classified files, Charles continued. By the time they surfaced, the war was a faded scar. Aides approached with a wooden case. He never sought recognition, living quietly with dignity. Charles revealed a distinguished service cross. This is yours, 53 years late. Frank stood, knees aching, as every soldier saluted, not from duty but respect. He accepted the medal, its weight odd, unnecessary. The story spread online, a video of the ceremony and a past museum incident amassing 9 million views. Letters arrived, children's, veterans, strangers, each touching Frank's heart. One photo went viral. Frank in his bathrobe, coffee in hand, metal case closed, reading the paper. Heroes don't need to tell you they're heroes. He resumed his routine, garden, newspaper, coffee, adding only a flagpole, raising the flag with recruit's precision. Reporters were dismissed. The medal's nice, he'd say. Friends were better. The world lingered, though. A 6th grade class visited, asking raw questions under an oak. Were you scared? A boy asked. Terrified, Frank said, smiling. Why'd you do it? Fear of leaving someone behind was worse, he replied. Another asked about fame. I'm not famous, he said gently. Just notice for a moment. The Austin Military Museum built a small exhibit, a quiet nod to a man who shunned the spotlight. Frank stood before it once, hands pocketed, grateful yet uneasy. He didn't need displays to know his truth. In a small, unassuming corner of the town hall, there was a row of chairs set apart, not with velvet ropes or gleaming plaques, but with a quiet reverence that spoke louder than any decoration could. These seats were reserved for veterans, not the ones adorned with medals or hailed in parades, but those who had carried their duty in silence. Their sacrifices etched only in the lines of their faces and the weight of their memories. A simple sign hung above, its words plain yet profound. No reservation needed. Your presence is distinction enough. Each time Frank read those words, a warmth stirred in his chest, a mix of pride and humility that he couldn't quite name. He'd never sought recognition, never wanted it. But knowing that this space existed for men and women like him, those who had served without fanfare, felt like a hand resting gently on his shoulder, acknowledging a life lived with purpose. Years ago, 3 university scholarships had been created in Frank's name, a gesture that both honored and unnerved him. He wasn't one for the spotlight, and the idea of his name being tied to something so grand made him shift uncomfortably at first. These weren't typical scholarships, though. They didn't demand straight A's or athletic trophies. Instead, they sought out young people who had shown courage in the quiet moments. Those who had stood up for someone when it would have been simpler to turn away, when no one was watching, when the cost of doing right might have been steep. The first time Frank met the recipients, he stood at the edge of the small ceremony, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his heart thudding with a mix of awe and responsibility. These kids, barely out of high school, had already shown the kind of grit he recognized, not from battlefields, but from the everyday wars of conscience. As he shook each of their hands, his grip firm but warm, he looked into their eyes and said, "Make it count." The words weren't a command, but a plea, a hope that they'd carry forward the same quiet resolve he'd tried to live by. In their faces, he saw flickers of doubt, determination, and dreams, and he wondered what paths their choices would carve. Back home in the cluttered drawer of his kitchen, where unpaid bills mingled with scribbled grocery lists and stray rubber bands, Frank kept a letter that meant more to him than any medal could. It was from General Landon, a man whose name carried weight in halls of power, but whose words to Frank were raw and unguarded. Frank would unfold the letter late at night, when the house was still and the world felt far away, tracing the creases worn soft by time. The final paragraph always caught in his throat, no matter how many times he read it. Landon wrote of a lesson Frank had taught him, not through speeches or grand gestures, but through the kind of choices made in the shadows. When no one was there to applaud, when no reward was guaranteed, when doing what was right might demand everything. Landon credited Frank's example as the root of whatever good he'd done in his life, and he thanked him for the gift of 5 decades he hadn't expected to live. Those words landed heavy on Frank's heart, not because they praised him, but because they reminded him of the men who never made it back, the ones whose absence still ached like a phantom limb. He didn't read the letter to feel proud. He read it to remember, to carry their weight a little longer. Frank didn't care if anyone remembered his name after he was gone. Fame was a fleeting thing, and he'd seen enough of life to know it didn't fill the quiet hours. What mattered to him was showing up, arriving on time, taking his seat in that reserved row, and honoring the ones who never came home. He'd sit there during the town's memorials, his hands resting on his knees of his neatly pressed trousers, his thoughts drifting to faces and voices long gone. Each name read aloud during those services felt like a promise kept, a vow to live in a way that made their sacrifice mean something. His presence wasn't about claiming glory, it was about bearing witness, about standing in the gap for those who couldn't. Yet, in that quiet dignity, Frank unknowingly left a mark that even a 4-star general couldn't ignore. Landon had told him once, over a rare coffee shared years after the war, that Frank's resolve had stopped him in his tracks. A man who'd seen the worst of humanity and yet still chose to stand tall had a power that no rank could rival. True honor, Frank had come to believe, didn't need a stage or a bugle call. It lived in the moments when you chose to act, even when the world wasn't watching. It was in the courage to stand firm when others faltered, to return for someone when every instinct screamed to run. The bravest acts, he knew, often went unseen, their witnesses only those whose lives were spared. Frank thought of the men he'd pulled from the fire, their eyes wide with fear and gratitude, their names now just whispers in his memory. He didn't need anyone to tell him those moments mattered. They were enough in the lives they'd touched. And as he sat in that corner, surrounded by other veterans whose stories were just as silent, he felt a quiet strength. Some stories didn't need to be retold endlessly to endure. They lived on in the choices they inspired, in the lives they shaped, in the hearts of those who carried them forward.